Hey everybody, Pastor Mark here. I want to welcome you to our first little screencast on our Sunday morning Bible study called Mere Churchianity. It's loosely based on a book by Michael Spencer of the same name, where he's inviting people to come back to what he calls a Jesus-shaped spirituality. And for us, we're using this as sort of a talking point for our topic of studying Luke chapter 15, which is one of the texts Michael invites the reader to study in his book. And with the question primarily in mind of saying, hey, there's been people who say things like, we want to get Christ back in Christmas, that kind of, the Christmas kind of thing. Well, what if we went a step further and said, we want to put Christ back in Christianity? And it's this emphasis on saying, what in the church or our church practices maybe lacks Jesus being at the center. And what can we do, as every generation must, what can we do to sort of come back to that, to re-emphasize Him as our center and our focus and the power by His Spirit that we participate in Christianity? So with that, I want to bring up Luke chapter 15. And this past Sunday, we looked at the first two verses, which is this really interesting study right in the middle of the Gospel of Luke. And it's talking about when Jesus was interacting with the tax collectors and the sinners, as it says. So Luke himself, he narrates, he says, now the tax collectors and quote-unquote sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees, who were basically a group of people who were trying to get the people of Israel to be more faithful to God by observing the 613 commands found in the first 5 books of the Bible. And those first 5 books of the Bible were called the Torah. And that gets translated in our modern translations as law. So you have the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, which were the teachers of the Torah, the teachers of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So that's who these two groups were. These were the ones who were saying, be good, be sure and be a good person. Hey, and by the way, be a good person, follow the law. And then the ones who actually taught the law, who were the ones who were saying, hey, let's read these scriptures, let's learn what they say. And notice what they did. The Pharisees, these people who said, be a good person, and the ones who taught how to do that, muttered. And this word muttered is kind of one we zoomed in on, and I would encourage you to do the same. Because muttering is a very interesting and real thing that happens in the church. And I would just invite you real quick to think about this word. Think about when you last heard muttering, or as I was sharing with our folks on Sunday morning, when I last muttered. And it's very easy to think about other people who mutter, and certainly to not remember when we do. And this is just an invitation for us to say, whoa, let's stop. Because the whole contrast between Churchianity and Christianity is this issue. Well, there's a few others, but this is the primary one. And it's this heart which gets off track from Jesus. So what does a Jesus-shaped spirituality look like? Well, the Pharisees and the teacher of the law said it really well. They were like, hey, this man welcomes sinners. This is the first thing. And then the second thing is he eats with them. It's this idea that, for us, that phrase may sound a little strange, but eats with them, in their culture, that means identifies with them. If you sat down to have a meal with someone, you identified with them. You would never eat with someone that you didn't want to be seen with or identified with in that culture. So this is basically a simple translation you could do, is saying this man welcomes sinners and wants to be seen with them, wants to be identified with them. And of course, this was a scandalous idea for the Pharisees and the teachers of the first 5 books of the Bible. And so it's ironic and also powerful, and should be really strongly received by us, is that in this story, and we would argue that maybe through the whole of the Gospel of Luke, and certainly the other 3 Gospels as well, one of the primary, if not the primary antagonist of the story, that is to say, maybe we wouldn't say the villains, but certainly in that negative category, are the Pharisees and the teachers of law, the religious people, if you'll allow that language, maybe in the worst sense of the word. And this is what we talk about when we talk about churchianity, is that through the course of time, we as Christians sometimes can fall into this. And one evidence of this, or one piece of evidence of this, is some years back, David Kinnaman, with another group of people, wrote a book called You Lost Me. And it's basically asking the question, why young Christians are leaving the church. And he identifies a lot of different things, and we'll maybe share some of those details in the weeks to come. But the primary thing that causes people to not want to be around the church, in the church, worshiping in the church, is the judgmental attitude of Christians. In other words, these are people who, when you give them a survey, they'll say something like, I like Jesus, not so much the people who go to church, which is an interesting thing, and that highlights this contrast between churchianity and Christianity. Now, we're going to continue studying all of Luke 15 in the weeks to come. But what we also did is we took a look at Luke 19, verse 10, and I'm bringing it up to show us here verses 9 and 10. But I want you to see this, and we're going to talk about it more in the weeks to come. But look at this passage. For the Son of Man, this is Jesus talking, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save what was lost. This is his mission. And what we'll do is just quickly look at verse 1 and following to see the context of where Jesus says this. He says this as he goes to Zacchaeus' house. Now, Zacchaeus was a tax collector, and he not only was a tax collector, he was the chief tax collector in Jericho. And he's very wealthy, and a tax collector in their culture was pretty much a thief. You know, they could basically say, this is how much you owe, and then they would skim off the top, and you know how we know how that goes. That's nothing new in our world. But the issue here is that he wanted to see who Jesus was. I find that very interesting that this bad guy, so to speak, wanted to see who Jesus was. But he was short, and this is where all the songs from our vacation Bible school and Sunday school come from. Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he, but he wanted to see Jesus, and so he climbed a sycamore tree. This is what he did. And so when Jesus arrives, he says, you come down. I want to come to your house. I want to stay at your house. And I hope you see this is the same thing as when the Pharisees and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were muttering. And look at this. All the people saw this and there's that word again, they began to mutter. He has gone to be the guest of a sinner. But then it says Zacchaeus stood up, which means fast forward to the meal that they're having, because they would recline at the table. And so now Zacchaeus is standing up and saying, hey, I don't want to do that. I want to go with you. And he tells about how he's going to do that. And Jesus says, today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save what was lost. This is going to be our study in mere churchianity. So if you can make it on Sunday morning, great. If not, tune in back here a week from today, and we'll include a brief screencast to show you the scriptures we study each week. God's blessings, and have a wonderful day.